Welcome to Beth Tikkun and this series called Spiritual Seasons, where we are discussing how each of the weekly Torah portions fits into the calendar and the general pattern of salvation. This week we are in the double portion of Tazria-Metzora, 4 chapters altogether, Leviticus 12 through 15. In recent lessons, we have been talking about the state of childhood connected to the rebirth of Passover. With that in mind, I thought I'd start with a little story today that helps us to appreciate the wonder of a child. It's a little incident that happened when many left home and family to strike it rich out west. A lot of single people. During gold rush days in California, a lady took her infant to the theater one evening, and it started crying just as the orchestra began to play. "Stop those fiddles and let the baby cry," called a man in the pit. "I haven't heard such a sound in 10 years. The audience applauded the sentiment wildly. The orchestra was stopped, and the baby continued his performance amid unbounded enthusiasm. Infancy and childhood are precious, and we find ourselves in the calendar in just that sort of a condition right now, in a spiritual sense. So let's move to the portion now with a summary. Tazria means when she sows, meaning when a woman gives birth. The first section deals with the ritual defilement that a woman incurs as a result of childbirth. The second part of Tazria discusses the defilement contracted by a person or a garment afflicted with a condition known as zarat, which is sometimes translated as leprosy, though it's not leprosy, or Hansen's disease, as leprosy is called these days, and we'll address that question more later. Metzora is named for the person who has contracted zarat. The word is usually translated leper. The verse that provides the name of the portion is actually focused on the healing of the Metzora. The portion starts, "This shall be the law of the Metzora for the day of his cleansing." And the Haftarah in Isaiah is also focused on the healing of Israel. When the Metzora is recovered, there are certain procedures God commands to do before actually pronouncing him or her clean and allowing the person back into the community. In fact, the person is not healed until the priest makes this pronouncement, even if the symptoms are all gone. Now, the person remains a Metzora until the priest pronounces him or her clean. And so part of the procedure leading to that pronouncement is the taking of 2 birds to the Metzora outside the camp, right? The Metzora can't come into the camp. He has to stay outside on the outskirts of the camp, he or she. And so 2 birds are taken out there. 1 bird is killed and the other is set free. The procedure also involves the use of a stick of cedar, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. These components, including the birds, are also used when pronouncing a house to be clean after the house has been cleansed of zarat, which is the next topic, right? After the pronouncement and the cleansing of the Metzora comes the cleansing of the house that has zarat. And then the final topic in the portion is male and female emissions that render each unclean, including how the people are made clean again. So before we move into the main topics for today, I'd like to consider the idea of ritual uncleanness and apply that idea to the impurity that results from giving birth. I mean, what in the world? Why is a woman, unclean when she gives birth? So first of all, let's address what ritual impurity means. Being ritually unclean means that one is forbidden from entering the temple and taking part in that central aspect of the life of Israel. The temple is designed to connect us to God, our Maker, our Father, the lover of our soul. So it's a weighty consequence to not be able to draw near to God. On the other hand, we should note that since we do not have a temple now, these consequences are muted in our day. This is just not something that has a ramification for us today, not until we have another temple, that is. So another important question here is, what do the various situations that cause ritual impurity have in common? Why does something that may seem to be a very natural part of a human life, like giving birth or a woman's monthly cycle, render someone unclean in this way? So the answer from the sages is that ritual impurity results when we experience an encounter with death, or when the potential for life slips by without producing life, as in a woman's monthly cycle. That potential for new life has slipped by. And so that's another kind of death. So touching death makes us unclean. We are to be a people who rise above death, who transcend death. And we don't go back to that place where death reigns over us. God is the source of life. And if we are to draw near to him, right, if we're to go into the temple, if we're to draw near to him and make a korban, a draw near, we must not have the stench of death on us. When we come before the king, we wear the best clothes. We wouldn't go before the king in the ripped jeans we wear to mow the lawn. If we present ourselves like that, it means that we are taking the king lightly, and we must never imply that we are taking the king of the universe lightly. So ritual impurity prevents one from entering the temple grounds. Now, having said that ritual uncleanness results from a nearness to death, let's ask what giving birth has to do with death. Some say that giving birth focuses us on our own mortality and can even at times lead to a kind of paralysis and depression, right? We have this name postpartum depression. When a woman gives birth to a child, the parents have to dismiss the old life. The family is changed forever. There's a releasing and separating from that old life and that old person that needs to happen at this point. And separation is death. And too, giving birth is associated with loss of blood. And loss of blood is closely connected to ritual impurity because the blood carries life in a special way by God's design. God says the life, the nephesh, is in the blood. So in Grant and Robin's Parsha discussion this week, they wrestle a bit with why it should be that when a woman gives birth to a girl, her impurity lasts twice as long as when she gives birth to a boy. Why does giving birth to a girl make her unclean twice as long? And so Grant explains that the difference is that the boy's own blood is spilled on the 8th day at his circumcision. And this is innocent blood. This spilling of innocent blood pictures the Messiah and acts to lessen the mother's impurity. So that's an explanation to think about, maybe talk about. But I want to suggest some reasons for the mother's impurity at birth, when she gives birth, that go even a bit deeper. So the next few minutes, we're going to be a bit in the weeds here, but we'll move on to another topic before too long here. So there's some foundational ideas here to parse out if we can muster the patience for them. So you might need to listen to it more than once. Let's start by noticing that the Hebrew for giving birth is connected to the idea of sowing seed. Tazria is the name of the first portion here. Tazria, and seed in Hebrew is zara. So the mother giving birth is the sowing of seed. When seed is sown, the process begins with death. Yeshua focuses on this idea connecting sowing to death. In John 12, Yeshua says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." He's talking about his own death. "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. So sowing starts with death, the separation of the seed from the mother plant, followed by the death of the seed itself, right? It has to decay in the soil there before that shoot comes out. And in the case of giving birth, the child has to separate from the mother. Again, separation is death. More than that, the spirit that fills the child's body that the mother has created has to separate from the spiritual realm to enter that newly created body. So this is another kind of death connected to the birth of a child. But neither of these explanations quite answers why a mother is rendered twice as impure when she gives birth to a girl versus a boy. So let's try to go even a little bit deeper. Beyond the baby separating from the mother, and beyond the spirit separating from the upper realm to come to the lower realm, and beyond the shedding of blood, all of those, the woman inherently has a kind of connection to death that the man does not have. And so she also has this closer connection to ritual impurity, since ritual impurity results from contact with death. So let me explain that. God has given women an inherently deeper connection to the physical world. And the physical world is initially a separation between us and God. It's a separation we are meant to overcome, but at first, the physical is allowed to rule over us, and in a very real way, it does separate us from God. So why do I say that women are given a deeper connection to physicality, which separates us from God? So consider these facts. To the woman has been gifted mastery of space and time. And space and time are the two main dimensions of physicality. Women take the space of a house and make it a home. They have that gift and are specially associated with the home in Jewish thought and in Jewish life. And women have a special connection to time also, in that their bodies are connected to the cycle of the moon. And the moon dictates the calendar in the passage of time. So even more, women create physical bodies for spirits to indwell, right? They make a baby. They make a physical body within them. And so that spirit can come down and inhabit the physical realm. Within the woman's body, the fixed vessel is created for an infinite spirit to indwell. And two, women are generally more connected to their emotions than men are. And the emotions are connected to the nephesh, which is the lower side of the soul. So they have and by lower, I just mean the more physical side of the soul. So they have a stronger connection to this lower side of the soul. So let me be quick to say that the woman's gift of connection, greater connection to physicality, can be both a blessing and a curse. Our task here is to overcome the domination of the physical. And in that way, we grow in our relationship with God. So this means that if women start out with a deeper grounding in physicality, if they are able to gain mastery of it, then they have this great potential to develop in their relationship with God. They are masterful at creating physical vessels for doing the work of the Spirit. And that's what we are trying to do here and transcend. However, if they are not walking with the Lord, then they can easily fall away into base physicality. And how many women are being led astray right now by the lies that are spreading like cancer in our society now? We're seeing now that it is more often the women than the men who are out there screaming their support of the humanist religion these days and even voting for that agenda politically. And of course, there are lots of men doing that as well. But it's the women who seem to be rising up to be especially vocal as many come under the sway of these lies. might catch some flack for that, but I'm not married, so I can say what I want. So the woman has this great potential to go either way. And so listen to this. On the one hand, it is through a woman that the serpent brought death into the world. But on the other hand, it is through a woman that the Messiah was born. So because the woman has this greater connection to the physical, and because the physical is initially connected to death, the woman is going to run up against ritual impurity more often than the man, just by being a woman. Giving birth is creating a physical vessel for a spirit. It's creating from nothing, ex nihilo, we say. It's adding to this physical world. And the physical world initially separates us from God, as I've been saying. And so any birth renders the woman impure because she has contacted death through this act of creating a physical body. And let me suggest that this is also why giving birth to a girl results in a higher degree of ritual impurity, because the little girl brings with her a greater potential for creating in the same way that her mother does. And she has this deeper connection to physicality. Well, let's move on to another topic now before I get myself into more trouble. So before we go further with the Torah portion, we need to talk about the new month that starts tonight, the second month, called Iyar, and this special period of the counting of the Omer. So gaining an understanding of the type of growth God is specially making available in this spiritual season that includes this month will help us to understand why we're reading about these topics now in these Torah portions. It's pretty amazing how it all works together. Stick with me, we'll get there. So Iyar seems to mean blossom in the original Akkadian language, right? All these names that we're using came from Babylon, from Iraq, which the Jewish people kept. But in the Hebrew, the word, this Akkadian word, sounds similar to or, which is light. And there actually is a name for the second month in the Bible, and that name is Ziv, which means radiance. So again, we're talking about light. So in other words, the name of the month is very connected to the increasing light of this month. I always feel it's blinding out there right now. The leaves aren't quite out on the trees yet. It's taking forever. And there's just so much light. This is actually a season of the year where the most light reaches the forest floor. So the counting of the Omer spans the whole length of Iyar, this second month, making it the only month that has a special mitzvah every night of the month. Every night during Iyar, we count the Omer. And so in recent teachings, we've been comparing these Omer weeks to the early steps of a child and childhood in general. This nightly count is a kind of training for us. We gain a kind of foundational strength from it, a measure of self-control, control over the animal soul, as we focus on God and His commandments as each new night takes hold. As that darkness comes down, we're thinking of God and His commandments, and we're counting that Omer. So going along with this idea of childhood connected to this season, the mazel of Iyar teaches us something about the special challenge of childhood. The mazel of the second month is the bull, Taurus. The mazel of Nisan was Aries, the lamb. So we're moving now from the lamb that is passively led to the bull. That's like an infant. An infant is just passively led. We're moving now to a bull, Taurus, that has a strong will of its own. And never is our will stronger than when we are just coming into our childhood where we want what we want and we can say it now, right? And so think of a fighting bull and how much will and determination that bull in the ring has. A child has to learn how to submit its will to the parent's will. This is a great struggle for children, and we can maybe say that learning to submit to authority is the greatest lesson a child needs to learn. Dorothy Nolt has said, if a child lives with approval, he learns to live with himself. We don't want easy approval such that we learn to live with ourselves, because we don't come out of the womb as the most wonderful people, right? We don't want to learn to live with that. Parents need to be sometimes expressing the kind of disapproval that causes a child to learn to submit to the will of the parents. So in this time of the year, God is providing situations for us, so we need to be on the lookout for them. Situations that help us learn how to submit our will to His will, right? We wanted it to go this way, instead it went this way. Right now, you just have to say, Lord, let me submit my will to your will. It is possible even for a bull to learn how to do this. Submitting the will is a challenge, particularly for children, because a child lacks understanding and even the capacity to understand. Without understanding, we don't really obey with our hearts. So the child is being asked to obey without understanding and without the conviction of the heart that what they're being asked to do makes sense. The obedience of a child, and this is important, the obedience of a child is firstly obedience from fear, and a bit later obedience from duty. And these are necessary stages. Later in the process of maturity, God will open our understanding too, and at that time, the heart will be activated, and obedience will come from a place of love rather than fear or duty. But we start with fear. I don't understand why my parent is saying this to me. It doesn't make sense, but I'm afraid that they're going to spank my butt or something, spank my bottom, and so I'm going to obey. So the heart will come later. Beyond these associations with childhood and early youth, this period of the counting of the Omer has some complex layers to it, both positive associations and negative ones. We're going to try to bring these together. So we're talking about the month of Iyar, but the month of Iyar is really when most of the Omer is counted. So the counting of the Omer is a positive thing in that it connects the great spring Moedim, the Passover season, to Shavuot. So it's a time that helps us to build anticipation for Shavuot. Unleavened bread in the Passover season and Shavuot are two of the three pilgrimage festivals, and they're harvest celebration times. And so there's a lot of joy associated with each of them. Iyar is also known as the month of healing. The letters of Iyar, which actually technically has two yuds in the middle, two y's, Iyyar. And so that's said to be an acronym for the phrase, I am God, your healer. This is when spring really strongly is taking hold in the northern hemisphere. Although in Israel in particular, the winter rains are ending and the land is beginning to dry out, but it's still green. It's still a very pleasant time in Israel now. It's one of the most pleasant. And so Iyar is known as an important time for not only spiritual, but also physical healing. So these are some of the positives of the month wherein we count most of the Omer. On the other side, this Omer period of the calendar has actually developed into a period of semi-mourning connected to a specific tragedy in Jewish history, the deaths of tens of thousands of the great leader Rabbi Akiva's students in the 2nd century. They are said to have died during the counting of the Omer. And some say they died in a plague because they didn't honor each other properly. And some say they died from persecution. So there's the speculation that they died in the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happened in the 2nd century and resulted in heavy losses for the Jewish people. How can we understand how the complexities of this season fit together? This time of anticipation of Shavuot, the growing light and healing, and also this mourning over the tragic loss of life at this time. So the answer is that whenever God does a work of raising us up to a new level, what happens next is that he opens our eyes to the work that remains to be done in us. This means God allows the light to illuminate the remaining darkness that needs to be dealt with. It's one thing to take a vessel out of the darkness and set it in the light, but it's something else to then take the lid off and let that light shine inside. So the month is named for light, and it is known for healing, because this work of seeing inwardly is the beginning of healing. And, as painful as that is, and that painful seeing of how we are falling short is connected to the horrific historical event in Rabbi Akiva's time. So such a loss of life forces an inward look and primes the nation for a great work of salvation to come. And so this pain of seeing ourselves is particularly important at this time of year, because God is preparing us to receive the Torah anew, which will greatly further our salvation journey. So how is he preparing us? By showing us our need for the Torah. He shows us the darkness. He's preparing us by helping us to see the darkness. And when we see that darkness, we say, okay, God, well, what are you going to do now? I need some deeper salvation work. And this is the beginning of healing. But it's death. This is how death is the beginning of healing. So we have this very mixed kind of these mixed associations with the counting of the Omer and Iyar. The way the salvation process is playing out here reveals an important principle that we need to restate here. When God does a work of elevating us to a higher level, right, he elevates us, what follows is a cleansing of the vessel, and this cleansing requires a kind of death. A verse stood out to me from the Haftorah reading in Isaiah because it mentions the cleansed vessel. So in Isaiah 66, it says, that's the last chapter of Isaiah, it says, "And they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations as an offering to the Lord," a korban, a sacrifice. All these people are being brought from the nations as a korban to the Lord, on horses and in chariots and in litters and on mules and on dromedaries, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, says the Lord. Just as the Israelites bring their grain offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord. First elevation and then the cleansing of the vessel. And that starts with seeing what's going on in there. Remember that the real focus of the Passover season is the second in that group of 3 moedim, unleavened bread. It is unleavened bread that stretches out for 7 days. In the Passover teaching, we connected unleavened bread to emptying out that which fills the vessel, like emptying the air out of the bread, the spirit from it. It's a focus on death. And more than the other 2 moedim in the Passover season, unleavened bread sets the tone for this part of the calendar. It's about God showing us what to empty out and beginning that cleansing process, the cleansing of the vessel so that it can be filled with a new spirit. And so we see that matzah, this is also part of it. There's a new filling happening as well. And so we see the matzah of Passover and unleavened bread. It changes to the leavened loaves offered on the altar at Shavuot. 2 leavened loaves offered at that time, filled up again with new life. So let me summarize some of these thoughts about Iyar before we return to the Torah portion. The word Iyar in the second month have close connections to the idea of light. Light means illumination, shining a light on something. And so this is a time for introspection, for looking inward, and for the beginning of cleansing the vessel. After being elevated spiritually, as we are learning to walk in this new cycle, God is helping us to lift the lid and let the light inside. It is exposing the darkness there that he will help us address in this cycle of salvation. This is the beginning of healing. Of course, we can always be about this business of asking God to shine the light on the areas he is bringing deliverance for in our lives, not just in the month of Iyar. We can always be asking him to show us this. But one of the points of studying the calendar is that we want to get in tune with the emphasis of each season of growth, because this is when it's easiest to grow in this particular way, when God is providing a special energy for that specific kind of growth. Well, with this background now for the month of Iyar and the counting of the Omer, let's turn now to connecting the portions of Tazria-Metzora to the calendar and Iyar in particular. To put it simply, in these portions that deal especially with the condition of Zarat, we are seeing in a graphic way how God helps us see our inner impurity, right? Lift the lid off, see what's going on inside. He actually allows this inner impurity to show on the outside so that we can begin dealing with it. So let's talk for a minute about this disease called Zarat that is usually translated as leprosy. Once again, Zarat is not leprosy. For one thing, it can affect clothing and homes. Also, unlike leprosy, if the person's entire body is covered with it, he or she is pronounced pure. Zarat is understood to be first and foremost a spiritual disease. The Quixote Komish says this: Zarat is neither any disease with which we are familiar today, nor any natural disease that was ever known to humanity. It is a physical condition directly and miraculously resulting from some spiritual flaw, rather than one contracted by a lack of hygiene or by exposure to any physical contagium. So in support of this view that Zarat is first and foremost a spiritual malady, notice that in the text, one of the defining characteristics that is mentioned over and over for identifying Zarat is that the mark on the skin appears to be deeper than the skin. So again, Zarat is an indication of a deeper problem, an inner problem, a spiritual problem that goes deeper than the external skin. Most of our diseases are the result of spiritual issues, but this one is allowed to express itself outwardly in a very specific way. So remember that ritual uncleanness results from coming close to death. The Metzora is a walking picture of death. Zarat physically pictures death in that the skin turns the color of a corpse, white, meaning it's drained of blood. For a Caucasian, anyway, that's white. And the life is in the blood. So with Zarat, patches appear on the skin wherein it would seem the pigment is lost. So this implies something interesting, by the way, for the odd law that someone entirely covered in Zarat over their whole body is pronounced pure. They are pure because they are effectively dead, entirely dead. And this implies that their judgment has come. And they either transcended when they had the chance to, or they descended, one or the other. So either way, there is no point any longer in separating such a person from the community, because their opportunity for personal growth is past. They either grabbed a hold and they repented, or they didn't. And either way, they're not a big danger to the community. Either they are so given over to sin that no one takes them seriously, or they are cured of it. So getting back to what these portions have to do with Iyar, this is a double portion about spiritual impurity that becomes manifested on the outside so that we can see it, particularly in the case of Zarat, which is the majority of the reading. Iyar is about God shining the light into the vessel to see the darkness there. And now we are reading about how God exposes inner darkness by making it visible as Zerat. His purpose for exposing it is to bring the afflicted one to repentance. It is God's graciousness to us that he would allow such a thing to manifest. Zerat is a gift of temporary death, a separation from the community life, and the temple life that leads us to work on the soul, to cleanse it with God's help. And this, in the end, leads to a greater connection to God and others than we had before the Zerat manifested. And connection is life. The portion could not illustrate better what this spiritual season is all about, that lifting of the lid and seeing the problems inside. Again, when God raises us up to a higher level, this is followed by cleansing. We have just been elevated at Passover, and now we're reading about cleansing the vessel in these portions. One point to take away here is that God will bring about what is required for that cleansing to happen. God will give us the gift of Zerat, and he makes it clear that the process for making clean is also within our reach, right? It's got all these laws. You know, do this, do this, do this, do this. That's within our reach, this cleansing. And it's really talking about repentance. So being led to repentance is truly a work of God's grace. So it's fascinating that when Israel was a young nation, God used this type of rather obvious spiritual manifestation as a teaching tool. But in latter years, he withdrew it. We don't have Zerat today. So this is an example of how God can work more openly at early stages when we are younger, and how he becomes more hidden at later times as we mature. We talked about that in part of the yearly cycle, God's hiddenness as we're getting older in the cycle. So though we seem to not have this condition in modern times, here we at least are reading about it now and studying it in this early part of the yearly calendar, and even just studying it has an effect on us. Now, you can't read through these portions and not feel a bit queasy. It puts some fear in us. Who knows if God will bring such a thing back eventually? And I, for one, don't want to be the first to have Zerat again. So it's an encouragement to me to avoid whatever the sages say causes Zerat. And they do talk about specific spiritual maladies that they associate with getting Zerat. So let's talk about that, what they say. One of the things that they associate with the disease of Zerat is haughtiness, pride, which the sages connect actually to the cedar stick. The cedar is the tallest tree, the strongest tree in the Middle East, and is associated with pride and haughtiness. And so we see that cedar stick in the cleansing process there when the Metzora is pronounced clean. But the main sin connected to Zerat, according to the sages, is evil speech, lashon hara, which the sages connect to the two birds used in the cleansing process. Birds are always chattering. You know, sometimes it's really irritating, and sometimes it's beautiful. You know, sometimes it's like, that is not melodious at all. You know, and if our tongues are always working like that, like a little bird, we are bound to slip up and misuse them. So lashon hara is absolutely deadly and will ravage a community like fire spreading through a dry forest. The sages say that the word Metzora is a contraction of the Hebrew words motzi ra, someone who spreads evil or slander. Lashon hara is the practice of speaking true things about people that are negative when others don't need to know. We tend to think that if we are saying true things, it's okay to say because some other person needs to know. And maybe we think people should know what they're dealing with when they engage with that person. You know, don't be fooled by that person. They're really a sinner, you know. Or maybe we preface our juicy gossip with, we need to be praying for so-and-so. Did you hear the mess he got himself into? Really, we're just enjoying tearing someone else down. It's a very selfish thing. And so in truth, it's almost always better if people don't know the faults of others. Lashon hara is the unmasking of someone, the undressing of someone in front of others. Usually, speaking true things that are negative is simply not necessary. Lashon hara creates walls between people. You're literally splitting people from other people when you say negative things that are true about people. When you know a juicy bit of gossip about someone, so moving forward, it's hard to see that person for the bright spiritual essence they are. Instead, we will always be pushed to see the sin rather than the person, right? We'll see the fallen flesh. We're always trying to be looking past that, at the person underneath all of that. So lashon hara blocks us from really seeing people, seeing the true identity under the flesh, and we end up relating to people coldly rather than with warmth. Now, if there's a safety concern, then speak out. If someone's about to hire a babysitter who has a history of putting kids in jeopardy, you need to tell that person what you know. If someone's about to get married and what you know might sway their decision, like something negative about the person they're considering marrying, you probably need to tell them. But usually we simply don't need to be parading others' nakedness in front of other people. It's considered one of the most damaging things we can do in the world. And we're not allowed to listen to someone else speaking lashon hara either, which is one problem with talk radio these days and so much of the political discussion out there. If we are trapped in a plane next to someone who won't stop speaking lashon hara, we're supposed to disbelieve them. We assume that they're saying, what they're saying is exaggerated, or that they misunderstood the person, or what they're saying is simply untrue. So in that way, we can protect the person being talked about. Well, we need to review this topic periodically and intentionally build up again a resistance to speaking lashon hara, because our resistance to this form of evil fades. Lashon hara is all around us. And we almost, in America, have this sense that it's almost a good thing to speak out. I really didn't feel much of an inhibition in my church upbringing against speaking lashon hara. It just wasn't taught against, because if it was true, you're supposed to say it or something. Well, hardly anything else will cause separation within a community faster than this specific evil. Many find the Chofetz Chaim's Daily Companion a critical resource in helping us turn away from lashon hara. And we have some copies here in the BT library if you want to check that out. It's the Chofetz Chaim's Daily Companion. So because lashon hara is so deadly to a community, the Metzora must be completely isolated outside the camp, even isolated from other Metzoras. And two, they are separated to experience what they did to others, because what they did caused death, separation. It is said that the sin of lashon hara kills three: the speaker, the listener, and the one who is spoken about. Being put outside the camp is not retribution. It's designed to bring awakening and repentance, right? It's a kindness, actually. And so our words have great power to shape our reality. Hannah Weisberg writes, "Never tell your child that she is a failure. She will begin to see herself as incapable and unworthy. She will see it futile to even try. Never tell your spouse that he is a loser, stupid, or clumsy. Your words will become self-fulfilling prophecies." And I would add that we shouldn't be telling children, and this comes from teaching of Devorah Berkowitz, that we should never tell them that they are good kids or bad kids. You're a good girl, you're a bad girl. There's no such thing. Such labels make a huge impression on kids. How damaging is it for a child to internalize the idea that they're a bad kid? Rather than talking about good kids and bad kids, we should be praising the good choices they make and reproving the poor choices. We are all pure spirits wrapped in the fallen flesh, and we're making choices all the time for life or for death. We have to take care to emphasize the child's ability to make good choices rather than putting on them a label that will shape them from that moment onward. For the rest of their lives, they deal with these labels that we put on them. So beyond refraining from speaking negatively about each other, let's focus at this time on actively overlooking the flaws in others within reason, right? Safety is always a priority. We want to make a special effort now to see the good in others and to speak that out. When we speak forth what is good in others, we empower that good in them. We make them want to even more fully live up to that goodness you have seen in them. If instead we point out how they are not measuring up, the effect of speaking that out into the world is to give it more weight. We increase the burdens on people's shoulders when we speak out this kind of negativity, and even when we think it, because even our thoughts change the universe. So let's turn now to a more direct focus on Yeshua regarding the topics we're talking about today. So first, let's notice in the text the various instruments used to cleanse a Metzora and also a house cleansed of Zarat. So these actually picture the Messiah. It's not hard to see in them these tools that are used in this pronouncement process, this cleansing process. So they are 2 clean birds, a cedar stick, a scarlet string, and hyssop. And we mentioned this before. So we see the Messiah here in these tools of cleansing. Yeshua is, first of all, the bird that is slain. Remember, one bird is slain, the other one is set free. The one that's set free is first dipped in the blood of the slain bird. So how is he slain? How is Yeshua slain? He is killed on the wooden cross, and that's the cedar stick. And it is there that his blood flows down, and that's the scarlet string. And that blood is applied to us as a covering that passes us from death to life, which is the hyssop that was used to apply the blood of the Passover lamb to the individual doorways, each home, each family, each person, so that they were told in Egypt, take hyssop and dip it in the blood and apply it to the doorways, each family. And finally, so that blood of Yeshua, it covers us. And finally, Yeshua is the bird that is allowed to go free. This bird could have been the one chosen to die, but it was pardoned. And so its life was returned to it. This is a picture of the resurrection of the Messiah, whose life was returned to him as well. The Metzora is cleansed through none other than the work and the blood of Yeshua the Messiah. Right? All these tools are picturing what he does. And all healing comes through him. So I have one other point to add here directly connected to Yeshua. It's fascinating that the Jews have a strong tradition of connecting the Messiah not so much to the instruments of cleansing, but to the Metzora, the leper. And this is also true. He's not only the things that cleanse, but he's the Metzora himself. And so the believer can make this connection rather quickly. We understand that Yeshua on the cross took upon himself the sins of the world, and in that way became unclean as anyone could ever be or would ever be. But what's fascinating to me is that the Jews also recognize this quality in the Messiah. You would think that they would be thinking the Messiah is so pure, entirely pure, but they know better because they see in the scripture something else. So let me read a quote directly from the Kihot Komesh, which is a Chabad-produced commentary drawn from the teachings of the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, who has had he's been one of the most influential rabbis of modern times. And here is what this ultra-Orthodox Jewish commentary says. The sages of the Talmud say that the Messiah's epithet, name, is the Metzora of the house of Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, citing the verse, "In truth, it was our illnesses that he bore, and our pains that he carried, but we regarded him as a Metzora, smitten by God and afflicted." So this commentary actually quotes this famous prophecy from Isaiah that speaks so readily to Yeshua. I think our Jewish brothers and sisters are not far from seeing Yeshua for who he is. We need to keep praying that God would reveal him to them. Well, finally today, let's turn briefly to Joshua chapters 20 and 21. Here we read about the establishing of 6 cities of refuge, 3 west of the Jordan and 3 on the east of the Jordan. We also read about the allocation of cities for the Levites. So first, let me just point out once again the pattern of God's act of elevation being followed by an act of cleansing. In bringing Israel across the Jordan, that was an act of elevating Israel. And when did that happen? It happened near Passover. They celebrate the Passover right after crossing over and undergoing the second circumcision. Passover is the time for this kind of elevation, especially. We see a reflection of that on the other side of the calendar too, and we'll also see a cleansing on that side of the calendar that follows. So we've been reading in Joshua about the whole phase of cleansing the vessel that follows that act of elevation, of crossing the Jordan. And so we've been reading about the battles to rid the land of the squatters who do not have a right to be there, the Canaanites. The Canaanites are the uncleanness in the vessel of the land. So the other point I want to make here today revolves around the question of why the unintentional manslayer has to wait until the death of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, before he can return home from a city of refuge, assuming he's been previously proven innocent when he stood trial. So what does the high priest have to do with the situation? I recall that at this point in Jewish history, when Joshua was written, there was no Israeli king. So at this point, the Kohen Gadol is the earthly head of the nation. As such, what happens in Israel under his watch, under his authority, imparts some culpability, some guilt to him, some, measure of this happened under your watch. And when he passes away, he takes that culpability with him. And is this not a picture of the Messiah, who is the Metzora? What we're seeing here in this obscure law referenced here in Joshua is an example of the principle of the Metzora, the idea that the Messiah, who is our heavenly high priest, bears upon his shoulders the sins of the nation, and with his death, he takes away the sins of the people. This also explains why the Torah becomes so focused on the kings of Israel and their leadership. Such and such was a good king, and he did this and this. As the head goes, so goes the nation. And a connected idea here is that if we are elevated to leadership, we better be willing to take responsibility for what goes wrong under our leadership. So we see here that God imparts at least some of the guilt that happens under, among the people that he oversees. Some of that, at least a little, is imparted to the leader, the head. Well, we'll have to stop there for today. Thank you so much for listening. May God make us a people who do not shy away when he shines that bright light into our souls. May we embrace his humbling corrective measures in our lives and be quick to repent. May we be the kind of people who hate speaking negativity about others. And may we rise up to be the people God has made us to be. Shalom.